Hello again. So I'm excited to kick off this second half of the morning and to get to the balance of our speakers after what I thought was a terrific opening program. Just to say a little bit more about how the program came together and the framework of the program. Amber mentioned that the report ECOMOS issued last year called The Future of Our Past, Engaging Cultural Heritage and Climate Action was one of the contributors to fashioning the framework for this program. And you can find that on the ECOMOS webpage. Just 30 seconds about what that report aimed to do. The report tried to do two things. It tried to look at the impacts of climate change on 6 typologies of cultural heritage, and then also the ways that cultural heritage can be an asset to climate action. And to do that piece, it went through the Paris Agreement almost paragraph by paragraph and scoped out the remit of cultural heritage in each paragraph. One of the ideas for ECOMOS producing this report was to give cultural institutions a framework or a benchmark to evaluate their own engagement with climate change or lack thereof. And I really, really appreciate the Smithsonian taking on board that idea and letting us share it with you. As I said, about half of the whole report looks at the impacts of climate change on different types of cultural resources, different typologies. And that did then inform how this program is arranged, because what we're going to do for the rest of the day, the most of the rest of the day till we get to our closing keynoters, is to invite an expert from representing each of those 6 different typologies to give their perspective on climate change and that type of cultural resource. And so it's in your program, but just to say them again, the 6, I'm going to keep using the word typology, the 6 typologies that we're covering are museums and collections, archaeology sites, built heritage, so in other words, buildings and structures, cultural and historic urban landscapes, cultural communities. In the ECOMOS report, they're referred to as associated communities, and intangible cultural heritage. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge 2 people that are in the room who had a lot to do with the creation of this part of the ECOMOS report on which today's framework is based. One is Dr. Marcy Rockman, and when Marcy was at the National Park Service, they produced a seminal document along these same lines, and that was the basis for ECOMOS's work. And then one of the lead co-authors of that part of the ECOMOS report, Adam Markham from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who's a colleague of Ken Kimmel's, is with us as well. So you can see, Marcy and Adam, you can see we're standing on your shoulders in some ways. So now to our first speaker of the program. It's a friend of mine, Ashley Robbins Wilson. Ashley is the Graham Gund Architect at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where she oversees almost 30 historic sites that the U.S. National Trust for Historic Preservation manages. One of her focuses there is modernizing and stewarding those buildings. Before Ashley was at the National Trust, she was a professor at Clemson University and the College of Charleston graduate program in historic preservation. Ashley is going to speak to cultural landscapes and historic urban landscapes. I can't resist mentioning that Ashley's organization, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, is also a founding member of the Climate Heritage Network. So with that, I give you Ashley Wilson.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks to the hosting institutions, SAM and the National Collections Program and all the other partners. We sure appreciate this opportunity. I always like to start by explaining the National Trust for Historic Preservation a little bit. I've been there 8 years, and there was one of these organizations that everyone's heard of, but I just like to run through what we do. Even though we were chartered by Congress, we are a private nonprofit. We're a membership organization. We have lots of members here, as well as our staff. We create a magazine, we create a conference, we have a CRAC government advocacy group that are represented today. We have a legal team, we have field offices across the country that work on sort of preservation hotspots, and we have the Historic Sites Department. which is where I live. And so I'm in charge of the buildings that the National Trust actually owns and operates. And of those buildings, it's a wide range. They go from coast to coast, and it's every type of building, every type of collection you can imagine, and every type of landscape. It's still, especially compared to the UK National Trust, it's still a very small collection, which provides us some nimbleness in how we work. And then the National Trust itself has been sort of engaged in this sustainable heritage conversation for a long time. I don't know, I was a preservation geek growing up, and I got Preservation Magazine in the 1980s, and I remember this ad with the building as the gas can during the Carter administration. And then we also have a Research and Policy Lab. In the Research and Policy Lab, which was formerly Preservation Green Lab, one of the things they've done is help do the research to give you all the primary resources you need to do your work, such as save buildings and be able to defend why you're saving windows and not replacing the windows and with the buildings. So 2 of their seminal reports are shown here. But when it comes to the historic sites, and I've been a practicing preservation architect for 30 years. It's all I've done. I've been sitting in the back of the bus. I am not an early adopter of climate action or the sustainability movement, mostly because I was sitting sort of on my laurels of all I do is green. I'm saving buildings that sort of are low energy resource buildings. Our landscapes tend to be protected from development. Our landscapes tend to have a lot of nature in them. And so we haven't quite gotten, or I haven't quite gotten engaged. And we did all the easy stuff a decade ago. We changed our light bulbs, we put in interior storms, everything that you've done at your homes, we did. And we recognize it's time for us, and that's why we're all here today. It's time for all of us in our sectors to sort of reach out and go forward and figure out what to do. My problem was I wasn't quite sure what to do, which fortunately we're getting closer to. So one of the moderators from tomorrow reminded me that 10 years ago, we actually worked on a project together that hit many of the things that we're discussing. And at the time, I was a professor down in Charleston, and when you looked outside of our building out into the harbor, you saw this place that everyone said, well, it's not Fort Sumter. But there was this island out there that had some resource on it that looked like it was a fort that nobody really knew much about and was doing anything. And so I was able to partner with the Historic American Building Survey and get all the students out there, and we documented it. And there's a place called Castle Pinckney, which was an early federal sort of fort that was built before the War of 1812 to defend the southern border of the United States from the south. And then during the Civil War, it was used for POW camps for Union soldiers, and it was used as a lighthouse, but it was sort of out there because it's on this barrier island. It's out there, obsolete, with no use and not much memory of what it was. So after we compiled all the research and submitted to the Library of Congress, we were trying to, but what's next? It's got this fascinating history, nobody knows about it. So we launched with the American Collegiate School of Architecture a competition, an ideas competition for students in the States, all over the world, students of every discipline, to come up with, what do you do with this place? What do you do? How do you celebrate history at a place that's no longer maintainable? And the students had great solutions. It was basically ecotourism. You canoed over, you had these light pathways, you got to visit the nature. Whatever they built had to be flood-proof, it had to be off-grid because there's no sources of electricity out there. And then when I got to the National Trust, I've been fortunate enough to work on sort of a poster child building of flooding, which is the Farnsworth House. Just who's been to the Farnsworth House? I always like to know just like who's been there. So this is outside of Chicago, this building. It's designed by Mies van der Rohe in the 1940s, late 1940s. It's not built until 1951. And it is considered categorically one of the most important residences in the world. It's the first building to have glass on all sides. It has an open floor plan, so there's no walls, because how can you have glass on all sides if there's actually walls? It's magnificent. It's perfectly detailed. How's that? It's only glass and steel and travertine. Architects fawn over it. There's not an architecture who's been in school who hasn't studied it over and over and upside down. Our tourism at this site is 1/3 international, 7/8 design professionals. It's got crazy numbers. But what makes it so special is not just the architecture, it's how it relates to nature. It's that it really is metaphorically and symbolically sort of portraying how man is protected, yet right there in nature. So this river, I'm standing in this picture, I'm standing in the river, it's right in front of the building, and when you're in there, it's sort of safe danger. It's right in front of you, and you can feel it. And that's why people go. It's this pilgrimage site of man and nature and how you're fighting it. So this is a map showing Farnsworth House and how close it is to the Fox River. I was just there on Monday, and it's really laughable as you're driving on the roads around it. The roads are 25, 30 feet above. You clearly are going down into a floodplain, and Mies plops the building right there. It makes no sense why it's there. There's no other building around that's there, yet it is. And this quote's just showing the neighbors thought he was wacky too. Like, why would you build down there? But he did. And the reason he built down there is because he actually wanted the water to come up underneath the building. This was why it's designed. That's why it's lifted on the pilotis. So the water can come in, and then you can experience this, I don't know, tragic feeling of being on a boat, but on land, attached to the land. And our site floods every year. It covers the lower deck every 5 years. It floods, you've already seen our, flood porn picture. It floods every 17 years. And as stewards of the building, we're like, well, what are we gonna do? We have to figure this out because this is no way to steward this building. So we pulled together a team of some of the best architects and engineers in the country, and we started working it out. And we were very open. We had about a 4-year open process. So we hired a bunch of really good architects and engineers, and then we hired a bunch of other ones to peer review the first groups. And then we presented everything to the public, and we crowdsourced it and opened our website, and we went through every hand-raised idea of what to do and how to deal with it. And at this site, we decided that the relationship to the river is really important. Moving Farnsworth House away from the river is akin to moving falling water away from the waterfall, that the house just doesn't make sense without that relationship. So at this moment in time, the National Trust is not willing to leave the site, even though that makes a lot of sense, right? So we came up with a hydraulic lift solution. It's not the solution for everybody. It was the solution that we wanted to do here to keep us in this place. And right now we're currently raising money for it. But what I really learned during the process that's really relevant to the conversation today is that our period of significance at this site is way too narrow. It is basically written from the day that Mies stopped designing it to before the day that Dr. Edith Farnsworth moved in. Because as soon as she moved in, she ruined it because she had stuff. And she put things out, and it wasn't perfect. So what we learned while we were going through all the process of designing it and doing our cultural landscape reports and doing our historic studies is that it's these other layers that actually make Farnsworth so interesting. Dr. Edith Farnsworth was an amazing nephrologist. She did Nobel Peace Prize work on kidney and how it works with the pituitary gland. She was single, she played violin, she interpreted Italian poetry, and she hired Mies to build this building that didn't look anything like any other buildings being built in the country at the time. Everybody else had a Cape Cod or a mini Mount Vernon, and she picked this building, and she picked that architect, and then she was litigious, and she sued him when it didn't go her way, and she sued when the highway came close to the property. But so she's this amazing story. And then the owner after her is Lord Peter Palumbo. He owned it for 30 years, and she owned it for 20 years. And he's actually the person who created the Farnsworth we all know in our head, which is a piece of sculpture on a beautiful piece of green grass. That's all him, because Edith basically lived in the house as a meadow. That's all it was. There was no landscape. And then all the furniture is Palumbo's furniture. So it's all mixed up in our heads. And then, of course, the biggest character that weaves it all together, the Mies story, the Edith story, the Palumbo story, is the river. Because this site is so much about the river. And none of that was in our interpretation when I started working on the project. So now when you go to the site, and it is the year of the woman, so it's the year of Edith, and we are told it opens next month. But when you go, you actually see how Edith lived there. But there are interpretations about all these things. We're talking about climate change, we're talking about the river, we're talking about all the layers of history. Then the National Trust is working on, I'm not the manager of it, but we're working on this other project, Save the Tidal Basin, here with our partners, the Park Service and the Trust for the National Mall. And this is an ideas lab where they pulled together 5 really great landscape architecture firms, not to compete against each other, but to work together to see what can you figure out when it comes to commemoration and connectivity and infrastructure loss and tourism and all the things we're dealing with here in DC. And most of you are from here, but those of you who are not, recognize the problem with the tidal basin and basically everything on the mall west of the Washington Monument and south of the Washington Monument was it used to be a river, the Tiber River, which was a part of the Potomac, and it's all been filled in. And this is a 3-year project, and the end of it's going to be an exhibit, the National Building Museum, and an online exhibit, but all the architecture team came together in our offices a couple weeks ago, and they were just giving their initial findings and feedback, and one of the landscape architects had this quote that I thought was so provocative. There is no line between land and water. And it just really made me think about, it's such a modern construct to actually have a hard edge, that these two things have always intermingled. And it reminded me of this map I had seen this is the Gulf Coast near New Orleans, right after the BP oil spill it was made. But it shows, well, the name of the map is Oil and Water, Extracting Petroleum, Exterminating Nature. But what it's showing, all those gray lines, is the pipelines. So it's all this hard pipeline that's underneath the water and it's within the land. And it's symbolic of sort of this conflict. And there was another map in that same series that's called Of Levees and Prisons, Failures of Containment, Surges of Freedom. And that map is talking about how unnatural it is to try to contain nature the way we've been containing it. And so in New Orleans, they've been putting up levees since the 18th century. But it was really in 1928, after that big flood, that they put up so much in the state of Louisiana. And it was at that moment forward that the flooding got so much worse. So the floodplain grew as much as it did. And then I also show here a map of Charleston, because Charleston floods when the moon is out, the tide is high, and it rains. It floods anyway, but it floods because it's all fill. We're all living on, we filled in the ocean and we live on it. So going back to the ideas competition at the tidal basin, one of the teams put this image forward, and he said, how about Tahiti in Washington, D.C.? What if we just embrace, let the waters come, we will lift our monuments up on them, and we will figure out a way to get to them. And it really did open my mind to, what, it's constantly evolving. We had the L'Enfant plan, and then we had the Macmillan plan, and now we're going to come up with another plan. But I think maybe it's because it's so pretty in this image, and it's so sunny out, but it did totally change. I'm a very practical person, and all of a sudden I was like, I see this. We can design our way to a better future. So I have to say, I think the best design trend in the last maybe 2 decades is the fact that we're turning all of our old sort of urban infrastructure space that was on the edges into public parks. Because we are detoxifying this land and we are getting all the gunk out of the rivers. And the result is we have these beautiful edge conditions. So this is Georgetown. And then this is, we've got New York, we've got Vancouver, we've got anywhere in Ohio. I'm not sure where that other picture is on the left. But it's everywhere that you're seeing that all of a sudden this space is both protecting our cities, and we've created public space that everybody can go to. It's play space, it's fun, everyone owns it, we can all share it. And another amazing trend we've sort of seen on this is that all of a sudden our landscapes are being designed differently. For the first time ever in sort of the history of designing landscapes, this ecological landscape is suddenly appreciated for all the value it brings. It brings cleaner water, it brings biodiversity, it's cleaning our air. And so this sort of natural native landscape is all of a sudden appreciated by the American public. And this same trend is used on our rivers as they come into the buildings. And I know you guys have we've been to many of these conferences where we hear, we have these options. We can fortify and we can retreat and we can adapt. And this is sort of modulating and helping us figure out what's important and how do we do that. And another trend we're seeing is it's not just the strip of our imaginary line between land and water, that these new developments are pushing out into the water. So we have, you've heard of oyster texture, and we have marshlands, and we have breakways, all to sort of slow down the movement of tides and to better protect the people on the interior. I have these beautiful pictures in here just so we can rest and look at them. But all of this is to say, as designers, we're looking at the natural world. We're just looking back at the natural world, who's telling us how to design it. So here's a barrier island, which now we are designing back into our public spaces, rather than this could be anywhere in Florida if it had condos on it. So in my little world of stewardship of historic properties, these are the people I partner with constantly, all the time. And everybody has this growing concern. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I confessed at the beginning that the National Trust wasn't quite sure what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. And I would say the group that's pushed me the most is the American Institute of Architects, which they have done sort of an extraordinary about face, which is we have 95,000 members and we're 160 years old, and it's sort of a old institution. And and our Hippocratic oath as architects is health, safety, and welfare of the general public. And they made the statement that we can't do our jobs if we're not taking care of climate. We can no longer build buildings that are disposable and wasteful and making this situation worse. And they are giving all the members the information of how do you move forward. Because a lot of us are uninitiated like myself, and we need, if you can only do one thing, take this step. And then if you can only do two things, take these steps. And so they have something called the Framework for Design Excellence, and it gives you all the places that you can go in and start making your existing buildings and your new buildings better. And even though this map isn't for architects, I think it's why we're all here today, which is it really doesn't matter what industry we're in, we all have things we can be doing to move us forward and to move us all collectively forward. So now I just wanted to share sort of some of the things we're doing in our sites and truisms on sort of landscapes, which is having so many historic sites, regionalism, is key, and vernacular design is key. There's so many lessons embedded in these buildings. So the example of this one is the building was great. It still doesn't have air conditioning. It's in the South. This building had originally a cupola top that let all the air flow. And over time, it went away. We ruined it by making it a museum, so we shut down all the windows, and we don't let anything come in harm the collection. And we ended up making a building that really no longer works. So we're sort of undoing what we messed up with our own buildings. And here's another example right here in Alexandria, Virginia, but we have a site that has two buildings on it, a Frank Lloyd Wright Usonian building and Woodlawn, which was built by Thornton and is George Washington granddaughter's house. All of our tourists go to the Usonian. Everybody wants to know about the tiny house that's really well designed, that's low energy, and how that works. Nobody's really that interested in the story of their house except for architecture buffs. So as we tried to figure out how do we retell the story, when we look back and we broaden our period of significance, after that property moved out of the Washington family, Quakers moved in. And the Quakers, on the eve of the Civil War, decided, we don't want slaves here, we want only free labor, and we're going to run a farm and show the rest of this county how you do that. And so with that sort of behind our sales, we started a partnership with Arcadia, which is a sustainable food and agricultural group, and they're part of Neighborhood Restaurant Group, which has a lot of restaurants here. But so they've taken our heritage Garden Club of Virginia gardens, and they've made them into sustainable gardens where they're growing food and teaching children at farm camp how to grow food. And let me tell you, these changes aren't easy in our industry. The Garden Club is not happy. But we also this site's embedded next to Fort Belvoir, so we partnered with them, and we have our Veteran Farms program, and then they come into the food deserts in DC with this mobile market, all from the site. So we are constantly moving our history to be relevant to what's important to us today. And then, of course, all of our sites that are pre-19th century had cisterns that we no longer use. So things like this, we're trying to figure out, like, what was the history of how this place ran, and then use it again. Here's a property. This is Daniel Chester French's home up in the Berkshires, Massachusetts. Beautiful part of the country. You know, he's an American sculptor from the Beaux-Arts period. And for 40 years, we've had a sculpture show there, sort of in spirit of him. And it's kind of whatever's popular in sculpture. Sometimes it's kinetic, and sometimes it's, you know, whatever. And in the last year, we decided that we wanted all the artists to go into the forest and pick up whatever they found and make sculpture out of it. So those are all the images that are on the bottom. And then moving forward, we were thinking what we'd like to do is actually have artists have pieces that are speaking to this issue of climate action. And one of the things that inspired me, and I don't know how many of you have seen this example before, but there's a Dutch designer named Dan Rosengard, and he created this huge smog vacuum, basically. And it's shown here in China. And he puts them into parks, and it's sort of nanotechnology, but it sucks in all of the smog and makes that park clean again, 75% cleaner than it was before. But then what do you do with the waste? And so he's trying to figure out what do you do with the waste. And he's like, well, most of the waste, 40% of this waste was carbon. So they compressed it and they made these rings out of it. And then they sold the rings, and the rings pay for the smog machine. So he sort of has this whole circle of energy and life and cleaning. And I think at the National Trust sites where we do art and we do architecture and people come for all sorts of reasons, this type of sculpture is very appealing. It can tell our message. The same artist put up this billboard in Mexico City, and it, with nanotechnology, absorbs smog as well. If anyone's been to LA lately, you know that they started to cover all the streets with white to reduce the heat sink. So even though we don't have that many urban sites, we love this concept. And this is in Mexico City as well, and it's another one of, it's sort of like the smog machine, where you take recycled plastics and you make the planters, and then you hang up the native plants, and then it's taking all the drainage off of the highway, it's watering the plants, and then it's cleaning the cities, plus it's making our cities beautiful again. And then even though we don't build many buildings, when we do build buildings, we want to make sure that there's so much technology right now with carbon sequestering with new products, where they're doing it with brick, they're doing it with concrete. And so when we do build, we do want to use things that will help us. So cultural and historic urban landscapes, they are going to be the most affected by climate change because so many of them were built in places that are not ecologically maintainable. And so I think our role as stewardship heritage people is we're going to be constantly interpreting and reinterpreting them. Going forward with new construction, we have to make sure that we are making safer decisions about where we live, and we have to make sure that we do not encourage disposable buildings and wasteful buildings anymore. And then for us, the heritage professionals, we need to be flexible with our standards of how we interpret heritage going forward. We need to work with our peers and figure out in these communities what buildings are at the end of their useful life and what buildings have value to us and that we want to save. And that's the end. Thank you.